Hi, welcome to the Critical Thinking course. This course is unique in the sense that we not only will discuss the skills specific to critical thinking, but we'll also explore the knowledge that constitutes critical thinking. Particularly, we will discuss how thinking is or what thinking is according to cognitive psychology perspective, and then talk about how critical thinking is different from thinking in general, focusing on how people think or not think critically and what can be done to improve your critical thinking. Welcome to the course, and in this particular recording, we're going to talk about the context in which we will discuss critical thinking. Now, whenever we use the word thinking, we're specifically talking about thinking as defined by cognitive psychologists, because cognitive psychologists study thinking. So we're going to know what thinking is before we know what critical thinking is and how to learn to be a critical thinker. To set a stage for that, just keep in mind this particular framework that we're going to work on today, and we keep coming back to this framework throughout the course. So, a good critical thinker, you need to work on developing your knowledge base and your thinking skills. Now, we need to know what knowledge base is, then what thinking is. That's where we'll talk about the constructs which form the framework for this course. When we say knowledge base, it is referring to your knowledge about everything you have or learned in your life. This is your knowledge base. Thought and knowledge are important parts, and developing thinking skills and knowledge base are important aspects of becoming a critical thinker at a very general level. Thinking is a process of using, and by using it, actually changing the knowledge base you have in your mind. So, while knowledge base is a structure that's dynamic, changes every time you use it, the process of using it is thinking. So there is this dynamic relationship between how you interact with the knowledge and what happens to knowledge, which again influences how we'll interact with knowledge. So there is a dynamic relationship between thinking and knowledge. What is knowledge then? As we said, knowledge is an organized, meaningful connection of bits of information in your mind. That's knowledge. If this is you, this is your knowledge, right? There is also knowledge outside of you, let's say in books, in literature. Everything that is outside of you that is not internalized yet is also knowledge, but that's not knowledge in terms of you and your knowledge base. So I want to make sure you understand this distinction. So if there is a book, you haven't read it, you haven't understood it, you haven't learned anything from it, that is just information. This information has some content that by itself may be meaningful to the writer or somebody else, but it is meaningless to you because you haven't processed that information yet. In other words, you have not internalized the information. Once you convert this information and internalize it, it becomes a part of your knowledge structure. The information has turned into knowledge. The question is, how do you internalize and develop your knowledge base? One way of doing it is, say you have some information that you haven't learned yet. Let's consider osmosis. It's a construct in biology. It's knowledge out there, but it's information for you because you haven't learned it. When you try to learn this information, you try to understand it. What you're basically doing is you're creating meaning out of this meaningless information by making sense of osmosis. You always make sense of new information based on the knowledge you already have. That's why the more knowledge you have about a particular topic, the better you can make sense of the new information. So, whenever you're learning new information, you try to make sense of it by using the information you already have or the knowledge you already have. In doing so, you are learning and updating your knowledge base. If you think of knowledge base more as an interconnected network of bits of meaningful information, then you're updating that network of bits of information. In other words, every time you learn new information, your knowledge base gets updated. But in order for you to learn the new information, you have to use knowledge. You can see how knowledge and learning are related. In general, of making sense of new information to turn into knowledge can be at a very, very general level called thinking. So now you understand the dynamic relationship between thinking and knowledge, where thinking is the process of developing knowledge from the information. But for you to do that, you should have some knowledge base. But when you're thinking to make sense, it's updating your knowledge base. So you use knowledge base to make sense of new information, and the process is thinking. In thinking, you are updating your representation. It's a basic framework I want you to keep in mind about how knowledge and thought are related. And thought or thinking is more like a process of working on the structure called knowledge base. It's a process of manipulating, changing, restructuring your knowledge base. That's thinking. And we'll talk about different forms of thinking and how critical thinking is different from other forms of thinking and so on and so forth. Another way of looking at it is that you have your knowledge base, which is a meaningful connections of meaningful units of information. When you have new information, you do not know anything about it. This information, once you know about it, meaning once you learn, this known information itself will become a part of your knowledge. So thinking is a process of knowing in that sense. You may be wondering if thinking is this process of making sense of information. In doing so, you're updating your knowledge base, and of course, you're using a knowledge base. Then what are these things that we keep hearing about: sensation, perception, attention, memory? What are all these? Well, thinking is the general term we have given to all these processes, all these activities that happen in our mind that help us interact with the world, live in the world. These are cognitive processes, also called mental processes. Some of them you're aware of, some you're not, and we are not getting into details of it. All these mental processes together at a very general level, we are referring these mental processes as thinking. Okay? So if you take a class like cognitive psychology, you specifically classify these and talk about what is at the conscious level, what is not, what are the different kinds of mental processes. But here, for the purpose of this class, we refer to all such mental processes. We particularly pay attention to the idea that some forms of thinking are automatic and other forms are more controlled and in your hands. And we particularly focus on how to utilize and get control over these conscious processes. Okay, so if you remember at the beginning of this video lecture, we said that um, within the context of critical thinking, what is important is to know how you can be a good critical thinker. And it has to do with developing your knowledge base, making it stronger and broader, for which you require your thinking skills. So how to develop the knowledge base and how to think. And we'll talk about how to do these things in different contexts. So now that we have discussed some basics of the context for this course, the next logical step is to get some basic understanding, like a bird's eye view of what we will be discussing in each of the remaining units, which are units 1 through 5. Okay, we talked about how we think at a very general level and developed the framework that we'll be using throughout the course. What we'll do in Unit 1 is we'll talk about what critical thinking is, try to come up with a broader definition of it, and specifically pay attention to why the cognitive construct called memory is important to think critically. Then we'll move on to Unit 2, where we'll talk about the importance of language in reasoning. And we'll talk about some basic forms of reasoning. And doing so, we'll talk about how words play an important role and logic, the importance of logic, and how we draw conclusions. We'll talk about some basics of reasoning in this unit. Then we'll talk about the critical thinking in different contexts, starting with arguments and hypotheses, and learn to be a smart thinker. And the Unit 4 will talk about problem solving and decision making and how to be better at both. And finally, in the last unit, we'll talk about applying these skills that you've learned in your own real life in a way we will try to put together all these. Stay tuned. I'll see you in the next unit.